Hello, and welcome back to the Bankers Leadership Series in association with Wolters Kluwer, discussing recent survey results benchmarking financial institutions' data readiness for regulatory reporting and compliance. In previous chapters, we talked about regulatory pressures, we talked about technology challenges, and also data issues. In Chapter 4, we will explore integration challenges with regards to regulatory workflow. So, from the survey results, we found that only 6% of respondents have completely integrated regulatory workflow data, and the majority of those were based in the US. Peter, what are the challenges to integrating this workflow data, and what risks are being opened up by not doing so?
I think in relation to the 6%, my concern with that number is that may also tell you that there are 6% of respondents that don't fully understand the question or the problem. In terms of integrating data to support a variety of workflows, really there is no alternative but to provide a single source of data within the firm where information can reside, which can then be drawn into a range of processes that it's required to support. To me, the issue of regulation is almost secondary. The regulatory compliance requirement is only a requirement to comply with doing the underlying commercial processes of the entity properly, whether that be conducting transactional business or whether that be managing risk or whether that be undertaking some other necessary activity for the performance of the commercial activities of the enterprise. So I struggle with the idea that regulation in itself should be a focus for dealing either with data or with architecture, because these things really need to be designed in such a way that they come out naturally from the execution of those processes. Otherwise, all we're doing is adding cost.
It's interesting, obviously, that nearly 3 out of 4 respondents reported that creating an integrated and consistent view of data across their business was really their main challenge. Ruth, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's the first step, right? We mentioned earlier on data lakes or sort of centralized data hubs, and you were just mentioning the same topic. Getting all the data into one place, then making sure the data is constantly clean and cleansed, and then creating that data intelligence with it is exactly what is at the very essence of running a business. So you could almost argue that if you're not doing that today, you can't actually run your business properly. And that's the funny part, is that sometimes regulation has to come from the outside to demand certain aspects of delivery that are data-based, which then ultimately leads you to that requirement, but it should have actually been the first step. Because if you want to run your business properly, you need to know about the risks, the counterparty, the different business silos, how they interact with each other, and then in hindsight, the next step is sort of how you report that. But the reporting is an output of an existing activity. So it is quite helpful, though, that regulators sort of put back the stick and say, you should really be doing your business more properly, because that was, in a way, the reason for the financial crisis in the first place.
Yeah, sorry, I was going to add, because I think there's a time dimension to this, and particularly for a large international firm operating across many different jurisdictions, the crisis highlighted when many of us were being asked by our regulators to provide consolidated information and often risk information, and it took the industry quite a while to be able to provide that information. When I think the regulatory expectation was that it would be provided instantly or near instantly, and I think that's been a challenge. And the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision undertook an exercise through its BCBS 239 to really drive this and ensure that organisations, particularly internationally active organisations, can put their hands around this data across their footprint very readily. I think the challenge is that regulators are expecting banks to be able to move very nimbly and for them to be able to respond to regulatory requests for data very quickly. And that's because of, we discussed earlier some of the legacy issues. That is a significant challenge, but it is something. So that's an area where I think the regulators perhaps have pushed us to be able to provide a deeper set of outcomes from our data across our organisation. I think we would probably argue that pre-crisis we could probably get to kind of 90% of our data quite quickly, and perhaps around the periphery it took a bit longer. So there are some positive outcomes from the crisis in driving us to be able to put our hands around our respective data sources and ensure that they are fit for purpose and that our systems are much nimbler.
And Rajat, how do you think that organizations can really develop these plans for further integration?
So, I mean, I agree with the comments that have been made. Yeah, the challenges that were mentioned about getting the right data. I think Ruth spoke about the issues with regulatory compliance, creating the data lakes. Peter mentioned this. So I think every organizations recognize the problem. We work with a range of banks across all regions, all different sizes of banks. The ones where we have seen, the ones who have actually been successful, or at least in the right path, in the right journey, are the ones who have addressed this from a cultural and an organizational perspective. I think that is actually very critical in these large, particularly large multi-division, multi-region, multi-product banks. The different divisions work with their own, nearly their own taxonomy. They work within their own, not just data technologies, yes, of course, but there are different regulators, different taxonomies. Even if the data was available in one place, it's impossible for some of these organizations to put it together and use it in an aggregated way. So the organizational cultural mindset of thinking this through, it's much easier for some of the smaller organizations. For them, it's easier to start with. For some organizations like Citigroup or Standard Chartered, or these kind of institutions, it's a mammoth task. From an organization perspective, cultural perspective, defining why one is doing this and using some of these to run the business is where the businesses find value and they actually invest in this. Often putting the data together for regulatory reporting is viewed as if I may exaggerate, it's viewed as a necessary evil. It's nearly viewed as a cost center. It's when that is used for running the business, when they find value in that data, that's when I think the investments are going in, and and the integration process becomes faster and smoother.
So are you seeing much more sort of investment in this area, off the back maybe of compliance, but then also to Peter's point in terms of the business value in it?
We are seeing some investment. I think what we are definitely seeing is the intent and the intention to invest, but banks are limited by the fact that the investments and the resources are often spent on complying with the immediate regulation, the new regulations. And banks have spent a lot of money over the years. The costs have gone up significantly of regulatory compliance.
I think it's important to recognise that banks can't solve that problem by themselves. Richard mentioned the point about standardisation being absolutely crucial to data quality right at the beginning. And unless there is a systematic, sector-wide, taxonomic approach to data, individual institutions are going to continue to struggle because it's going to mean different things from different suppliers. It's going to mean different things in different jurisdictions, and no institution, however hard it tries, can reconcile that. And to pick up on Ruth's point, they need to put it in one place and then clean it, except what they do not need then to be doing is going back and adjusting it thereafter, because it means different things in different places or to different people or in different processes. They need instead to be establishing a discipline of making sure that it is not corrupted by that. And for that to occur, you've got to relive the LEI experience, the legal entity identifier experience, across every single type of data point, across every single data class, across every single aspect of regulation around data by international regulators. And I don't see that happening.
I think the Financial Stability Board is doing some work in this area with it's looking at universal transaction identifiers and product identifiers, and so that will help. But the challenge never stops. I've been doing some work recently on climate change, and it's something that has its own taxonomy, and that's coming into banking. We're having to assess the risks of climate change on our balance sheets through exposures to clients and other commitments that we may have. And again, that brings a whole another tax or data challenges and also a view as to the future. And that's a very significant challenge for us, because we're having to progressively, as an industry, look much more at the future through stress testing, through looking at climate change risk, and that's a very substantial challenge for us, because if we struggle with understanding our historical data and positions, looking forward and trying to understand a view of the future is a completely different challenge.
So thank you very much for your insights. We're now going to move on to the final chapter, Chapter 5.